Sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one refilling your coffee. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Blackwood Global's 48th floor boardroom, while Manhattan disappeared beneath sheets of gray. Inside, nobody noticed the storm anymore. The real disaster was already happening at the conference table. Who approved these numbers? Ethan Blackwood's voice cut through the room like cold steel as he slammed a 70-page report onto the polished walnut table. Nobody answered. 12 executives sat frozen beneath the white glow of recessed lights, avoiding eye contact while the company's stock ticker bled red across the giant screen behind them. 4.8% down in less than an hour. Nearly $900 million evaporating before lunch. Ethan loosened his navy silk tie with visible irritation. At 39, he had built Blackwood Global into one of the most feared investment firms in America, but right now the billionaire CEO looked less like a visionary and more like a man watching his empire crack beneath him. "You're telling me," he said slowly, dangerously calm, "that nobody in this room caught the valuation discrepancy before the Europeans did?" Silence. Only the faint tapping of rain against the windows, and the quiet sound of coffee being poured. Claire Monroe moved carefully between the leather chairs with a silver coffee pot balanced steadily in her hand. Black uniform, white collar, hair tied neatly behind her head. Invisible. At least that was what everyone in the room believed. Ethan barely looked at her as she filled another cup beside the chief financial officer. "The Frankfurt call starts in 12 minutes, one board member muttered nervously. "If they pull out now, the merger dies." Another executive rubbed his forehead. "We've triple-checked the projections." Claire reached the end of the table and quietly placed a fresh espresso beside Ethan's untouched cup. Dark roast. No sugar. Exactly the way he ordered it every morning. "The numbers aren't wrong," she said softly. "The timeline is." Every head turned toward her. Ethan looked up slowly for the first time all morning. Claire immediately regretted speaking, not because she was wrong, because she understood exactly what happened when people like her interrupted people like them. The boardroom fell into a stunned silence. One executive actually laughed under his breath. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her like she had just walked into the wrong room by mistake. "Excuse me." Claire swallowed carefully. The acquisition debt was calculated before the Zurich transfer finalized. The liabilities shifted 2 quarters later. Nobody spoke. A senior analyst frowned toward the screen. Another began flipping frantically through printed reports. Ethan's expression hardened. And how exactly would a waitress know that? A few restrained chuckles circled the table. Claire felt the heat rise behind her cheeks, but her face stayed calm. Always calm. She had learned years ago that dignity survived longer in silence than anger ever could. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan. Ethan folded his hands together slowly. Expensive watch. Sharp cufflinks. Eyes trained directly on her now. "Do you even have a degree?" The room waited for her to shrink. Most people would have. Claire glanced once at the financial model glowing across the 80-inch screen behind him, then back at the billionaire who had just asked the question. "2," she answered quietly. And just like that, the entire boardroom went silent. No one laughed after that. The silence settled slowly across the boardroom, heavy and uncomfortable, while rain streaked down the glass behind them like fading silver lines. Ethan Blackwood stared at Claire Monroe without blinking. 2 degrees. The words did not match the woman standing beside the coffee cart in a pressed black apron. One of the board members adjusted his glasses awkwardly. Another closed the folder in front of him as if suddenly embarrassed to be seen holding it. Claire lowered her eyes first. Not submissive. Controlled. She reached for the silver coffee pot again, intending to disappear back into the executive lounge before anyone asked another question. "Wait." Ethan's voice stopped her halfway through turning around. "Come now." Curious. More dangerous than angry. Claire paused beside the wall of windows overlooking lower Manhattan. 48 floors below, yellow taxis crawled through rain-soaked streets while the East River disappeared beneath gray fog. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. 6'2". Perfect posture. Navy Brioni suit that probably cost more than Claire earned in 3 months. Yet somehow the woman holding the coffee pot looked steadier than the billionaire walking toward her. "Explain the timeline issue," he said. Claire hesitated. Around the table, executives exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody liked this. Not because she interrupted, because they were beginning to suspect she might actually be right. Ethan noticed the hesitation immediately. "You already spoke once," he said quietly. "Finish the thought." Claire set the coffee pot down carefully onto the marble counter beside her. "The valuation model assumes Zurich finalized before second quarter liabilities transferred," she said. "But the transfer happened 17 days later because of the Swiss regulatory delay." One executive frowned. That delay was minor. Claire looked toward the projection screen. "Not after currency exposure adjustments." The chief financial officer slowly turned pale. Claire stepped closer to the screen now, drawn unwillingly into the center of the room. Her movements remained calm, almost reluctant. "Your analysts accounted for the acquisition debt," she continued softly, "but not the hedge timing after the euro dropped." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "How much did we miss?" Claire glanced at the numbers only briefly. "Approximately 342 million. The room froze again. Somebody whispered a curse under their breath. Another executive immediately opened a laptop and started recalculating. Fingers moved quickly now, nervously. Ethan watched Claire instead. Not the screen, not the numbers. Her. "That is impossible," one board member snapped. Claire did not react emotionally. "No," she said gently. "It is just expensive." A younger analyst suddenly looked up from his laptop, stunned. "She is right." Nobody spoke after that. Only the sound of keyboard clicks and distant thunder rolling above the city. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket while studying Claire with growing intensity. He had spent 2 decades learning how to read people within seconds. Investors, politicians, competitors, liars. But this woman confused him. Waitresses did not speak like this. They did not calculate hedge exposure from memory while holding coffee pots beside billion-dollar negotiations. "Where did you study?" he asked finally. Claire's shoulders stiffened slightly. Tiny movement. Almost invisible. But Ethan noticed everything. "Columbia," she answered quietly. Several heads lifted immediately around the room. One board member blinked in disbelief. "Columbia Business School?" Claire nodded once. "And Harvard Extension for Quantitative Economics." The chief financial officer looked genuinely offended now. "Then what on earth are you doing serving coffee?" The question hung awkwardly in the air. Too sharp. Too personal. Claire looked down briefly at the untouched espresso still sitting near Ethan's seat. Steam no longer rose from it. "Cold already." "Life changed," she said simply. Ethan expected bitterness in her voice. There was none. That unsettled him more than anger would have. A notification suddenly flashed across the giant boardroom screen. Incoming Zurich conference call. The room tensed instantly. One executive muttered under his breath, "If they discover the exposure before we correct it, the merger is dead." Ethan glanced toward the flashing screen, then back at Claire. His jaw tightened slightly as if making a decision he did not entirely understand himself. "Stay," he said. Claire looked genuinely surprised for the first time all morning. Ethan pulled out the chair beside him at the long conference table. Not dramatically, quietly. "If you are going to dismantle my financial team," he said, "you might as well help us survive the next 20 minutes. Outside, lightning flashed across the Manhattan skyline. Inside the glass boardroom, Claire Monroe slowly removed her waitress notepad from her apron pocket and sat down among the most powerful people in New York. The leather chair felt unfamiliar beneath Claire Monroe as the Zurich conference call connected across the massive screen. She sat at the far end of the boardroom table with her waitress apron still tied neatly around her waist while 12 executives pretended not to stare at her. The contrast would have been absurd anywhere else. Here, it only made the silence heavier. Ethan Blackwood remained standing near the windows, one hand resting inside his pocket while rain blurred the Manhattan skyline behind him. "Audio is live," the technology director announced nervously. The screen flickered once before revealing 3 executives inside a sleek European office overlooking Zurich's financial district. Sharp suits, colder expressions. One of them spoke first without greeting anyone. "Mr. Blackwood," the Swiss executive said crisply, "our team discovered significant inconsistencies in your acquisition timeline." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "We are reviewing the discrepancy now." "Reviewing?" Another executive interrupted. "Your valuation exposure exceeds $300 million. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. Claire remained still, hands folded quietly beside Ethan's untouched espresso cup. "Unless this is resolved immediately," the Swiss executive continued. The board will recommend suspending the merger. The words landed like falling concrete. Ethan glanced briefly toward his financial team. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Fear had a sound in corporate boardrooms. It sounded exactly like this. Quiet breathing. Nervous typing. Avoided eye contact. Then Ethan looked toward Claire. Not dramatically. Almost carefully. You said the issue was timing, he said. Claire nodded once. Yes. Can you prove it? Every executive in the room turned toward her again. Claire slowly reached for the remote beside the projection screen. Her fingers were steady. Too steady for someone sitting in front of billion-dollar negotiations while wearing a server uniform. She stood and walked toward the glowing screen at the front of the room. Black heels against polished marble. Soft clicks echoing beneath the recessed lights. The liabilities were calculated before the Zurich restructuring delay, she explained calmly while opening the financial model. But the hedge protection expired 17 days. Earlier than projected. One Swiss executive frowned. That would not create this level of exposure. Claire highlighted a section of the spreadsheet. Not alone. She pressed another key. Additional columns appeared across the screen. Currency shifts. Tax allocations. Deferred obligations. Your analysts modeled the euro against second quarter stabilization, she continued. But the market correction came after the debt transfer, not before. Silence again. Even the Swiss executives leaned closer now. Claire spoke softly, never rushing, never trying to impress anyone. That was what unsettled Ethan the most. She did not sound like someone showing off intelligence. She sounded like someone quietly stating facts nobody else noticed. The exposure compounds here, she said, circling a line item with a laser pointer. And again here. The chief financial officer suddenly straightened in his chair. That is impossible, he whispered. Claire looked toward him politely. No, it is just hidden beneath the conversion timing. Across the room, one analyst began recalculating at frantic speed. Another executive removed his glasses slowly, staring at the screen in disbelief. The Zurich office went silent. Finally, the oldest Swiss executive spoke again. Different tone now. Respectful. Careful. Who prepared this revised analysis? Nobody answered immediately. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on Claire. She lowered the laser pointer slightly. I did, she said. The Swiss executive blinked once. You are with Blackwood Global's strategic division? Claire hesitated for half a second. Tiny pause. Barely noticeable. No, she answered quietly. I work downstairs in executive hospitality. The room became perfectly still. One of the younger Zurich executives actually looked confused. Ethan almost smiled for the first time all morning. Almost. Apparently, he said dryly. We have been severely underutilizing our hospitality department. A few nervous laughs escaped around the table, but Claire did not react. She only stepped away from the screen as though she had finished refilling a coffee cup instead of saving a billion-dollar merger. The Swiss executive leaned back slowly in his chair. Mr. Blackwood, he said after a long pause, if this correction is implemented immediately, our board may reconsider suspension. Relief moved quietly through the room, like air returning after suffocation. Ethan nodded once. You will have the revised model within the hour. The Zurich call ended seconds later, leaving only the reflection of rain against the giant black screen. Nobody moved at first. Then suddenly the room erupted into overlapping voices. Executives talking rapidly. Analysts recalculating numbers. Phones buzzing across the table. But Ethan Blackwood remained silent. Watching Claire Monroe gather the marker pens she had used as if she did not belong in the center of the storm, she had just stopped. She turned slightly toward the door, ready to disappear back into invisibility again. Claire. Ethan's voice stopped her once more. She looked back calmly. Ethan studied her for several long seconds before speaking. Who are you really? Claire held his gaze quietly beneath the cold white lights of the boardroom. Then she gave the smallest smile. Sad. Controlled. Almost tired. Someone people stopped listening to, she answered softly. The room stayed loud long after Claire Monroe walked out of it. Executives crowded around glowing spreadsheets while analysts rushed through recalculations with the kind of panic that only existed when rich people realized they had almost become less rich. Ethan Blackwood barely heard any of it. His eyes remained fixed on the closed boardroom door where Claire had disappeared seconds earlier. Where did you find her? One board member asked, still staring at the corrected valuation model on the screen. Another executive shook his head slowly. Columbia and Harvard Extension? Working as a waitress? That does not make sense. Ethan finally reached for the espresso sitting beside his chair. Cold now. Bitter. He drank it anyway. Run a background check. The chief financial officer muttered quietly to another executive. Ethan looked up immediately. No. The single word cut through the room sharply enough to silence everyone again. Ethan set the espresso cup down carefully. Nobody investigates her. Several confused looks spread across the table. The chief financial officer frowned. Ethan, with all due respect, a woman with those credentials just walked into a billion-dollar merger meeting wearing an apron and corrected our entire valuation team from memory. You are telling me that does not concern you? Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. No, he answered calmly. What concerns me is that 12 people on payroll missed what she saw in under 3 minutes. Nobody argued after that. Across the hall, Claire pushed open the service entrance into the executive hospitality kitchen. The noise of the boardroom disappeared instantly behind the heavy door. Warm lights, stainless steel counters, the smell of dark roast coffee and fresh bread. Safe again. Invisible again. She exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in an hour. Claire. She turned toward the voice. Martha, the 60-year-old hospitality supervisor, stood near the espresso machine holding a tray of porcelain cups. Concern filled her tired blue eyes. What happened in there? Claire forced a small smile. Nothing. Martha raised an eyebrow immediately. Honey, 3 analysts just sprinted through this hallway like the building was on fire. Claire removed the black serving apron slowly and folded it neatly across the counter. Her hands shook slightly now that nobody important was watching. I just answered a question. Martha studied her quietly for a moment. You did it again, did you not? Claire looked away toward the rain-covered windows of the kitchen. Manhattan looked colder from this side of the building. Less glamorous. More honest. I could not sit there and watch them destroy the deal, she admitted softly. Martha sighed. Smart women always think silence protects them. Claire gave a faint smile. Sometimes it does. Before Martha could answer, the kitchen door opened again. Every employee immediately straightened. Ethan Blackwood rarely entered this side of the building. In fact, most staff members had never seen him this close before. Expensive suit, silver watch, calm expression that somehow intimidated people more than shouting ever could. The entire kitchen went silent. Ethan barely noticed anyone except Claire. She stood near the coffee station holding a folded apron against her chest, while soft rainlight reflected across the windows behind her. Smaller than she looked in the boardroom. More tired too. Ethan realized suddenly that she could not be older than 28. Everyone out, Martha said immediately, sensing tension before anyone else did. The staff quietly disappeared into the back storage area within seconds, leaving Claire alone with the billionaire CEO, standing beside industrial coffee machines and stacks of clean dishes. Ethan glanced around slowly. You come here after saving mergers? Claire crossed her arms lightly. Usually I refill creamers first. To his own surprise, Ethan almost laughed again. Almost. You embarrassed my executive team. They embarrassed themselves. Calm answer. No arrogance. Just truth. Ethan slipped his hands into his pockets while studying her carefully. You knew exactly what you were doing in there. Claire looked down briefly at the folded apron in her hands. Yes. Then why work here? The question came quieter this time. Not judgmental anymore. Genuine. Claire walked toward the sink slowly and placed the apron beside the counter. Because hospitals do not accept academic awards as payment. Ethan's expression shifted instantly. Small change, but real. Claire kept speaking softly while rinsing coffee cups beneath warm water. My younger brother got sick 3 years ago. She did not look at him while saying it. After my father died, there was nobody else. Ethan stayed silent. Claire dried the porcelain cup carefully with a white towel. Graduate programs stopped mattering after that. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the building, elevators chimed faintly in distant hallways. Ethan looked at the woman standing beside the sink in silence for several long seconds. Then his eyes moved toward the thick economics textbook partially hidden beneath the counter near the coffee filters. Pages filled with handwritten notes. Highlighted formulas. Margin calculations. She still studied at work. Even now. Even here. Ethan picked up the book slowly. Claire immediately stiffened. You are preparing for something, he said quietly. Claire took a breath before answering. I was. Ethan looked down at the notes covering nearly every page. Precise handwriting, detailed observations, brilliant work hidden beside sugar packets and coffee stirrers. He closed the book carefully. Claire, he said slowly, I think you are working in the wrong room. Claire finally looked directly at him again. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried something heavier now, something exhausted. No, she answered softly. I think I just learned people only hear intelligence when it comes dressed like them. For a moment, Ethan Blackwood forgot he was standing inside the executive kitchen of a $12 billion company. The rain outside softened into a low, steady rhythm against the windows, while Claire Monroe quietly returned coffee cups to their shelves, as if she had not just dismantled half his executive staff in front of international investors. Ethan looked again at the economics textbook resting beside the coffee machine. Hundreds of handwritten notes filled the margins in precise blue ink. Currency trends, market corrections, historical comparisons dating back nearly 20 years. None of it looked casual. None of it looked abandoned. You still study every day, he observed quietly. Claire adjusted a stack of porcelain saucers without looking at him. Reading is free. Ethan frowned slightly. You say that like it matters. This time she did look at him. Calm gray blue eyes. Tired eyes. When someone is choosing between tuition and medical insurance, free matters a lot. Ethan had spent most of his life around people who performed intelligence loudly. Expensive schools framed on office walls. Carefully rehearsed vocabulary during investor dinners. Men who needed everyone in the room to know they were the smartest person there. Claire was different. She hid intelligence the same way exhausted people hid bruises. Quietly. Automatically. Your brother, Ethan said carefully. Is he okay now? Claire dried another cup before answering. Some days are better than others. Ethan nodded once. He understood more from what she did not say than what she actually did. Silence had weight, and Claire carried hers heavily. Before he could speak again, the kitchen door swung open. A nervous junior analyst stepped inside, holding a tablet against his chest. He froze immediately after seeing Ethan standing beside the coffee station. Sorry, sir. I did not realize you were in here. Ethan barely turned. What is it? The Zurich board approved the revised model. Relief flashed briefly across the analyst's face. The merger is back on schedule. Ethan glanced instinctively toward Claire. She did not smile. She simply continued organizing clean dishes beside the sink. The analyst looked at her awkwardly now, clearly unsure how to behave around the waitress who had just saved $1 billion deal. Miss Monroe, he said hesitantly. The finance department asked if you could possibly send over your calculations. Claire reached for a small receipt pad near the counter and tore off a single sheet. In less than 30 seconds, she wrote 6 formulas, circled 2 conversion adjustments, and handed it back to him. Tell them the exposure disappears if they correct the hedge sequence before closing projections. The analyst stared at the page. That is it. Claire nodded once. That is all they missed. He left the kitchen looking even more confused than when he entered. Ethan watched the door close slowly behind him. Then he looked back at Claire. Do you realize what just happened upstairs? Claire rinsed another coffee spoon beneath warm water. A merger survived. No, Ethan stepped closer. A room full of executives with Ivy League degrees just depended on someone they would not have noticed in the elevator this morning. Claire finally stopped moving. Only for a second. People notice uniforms first, she said softly. Then they decide how much respect to give the person wearing them. Ethan leaned lightly against the counter beside her. Strange feeling. Standing in silence with a waitress while his company stabilized upstairs. Stranger still that this felt more honest than most board meetings he attended. You think I did that too? Claire looked toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the kitchen windows. You asked if I even had a degree before you asked if I was right. The words were not angry. That somehow made them worse. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. She was right. He hated that she was right. Because the question had come naturally to him. Reflexively. Years of power had trained him to sort people instantly by appearance, status, and usefulness. Claire had exposed that weakness in less than 10 minutes. I owe you an apology, he admitted quietly. Claire gave a faint, tired smile. You owe your analysts one too. Ethan let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Almost. The kitchen lights reflected softly against the silver espresso machine between them. Outside, Manhattan traffic crawled beneath rain and fading afternoon light. For the first time in years, Ethan realized he did not want this conversation to end. Not because Claire fascinated him, though she did, but because she spoke to him without fear, without calculation, without trying to gain anything. That had become rare around him. Dangerous rare. Ethan straightened slightly. Come upstairs tomorrow morning. Claire immediately shook her head. No, the answer came too quickly. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You did not even hear the offer. I know how this works. She folded the white dish towel carefully beside the sink. People get impressed for one day. Then reality returns. Reality, Ethan repeated. Claire glanced down at the apron still folded beside the counter. Reality is rent. Medical bills. Double shifts. Ethan looked at the apron, then back at her. Reality, he said quietly, is that you are wasting your life hiding in this kitchen. Claire picked up the apron slowly and held it against herself again like armor. No, she whispered softly. I am surviving it. And somehow those 4 words hit harder than anything said in the boardroom all day. Claire Monroe left Blackwood Global 2 hours later carrying the same canvas bag she had arrived with that morning. Rain still covered Manhattan in silver reflections while office towers glowed against the darkening sky like enormous glass lanterns. She walked past chauffeurs holding umbrellas for executives who barely noticed her existence. Same city, same uniform, same invisible woman. Yet something felt different now. Dangerous different. Her subway ride downtown smelled faintly of wet coats and burnt coffee, while exhausted commuters stared silently at their phones beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Claire stood near the train doors with one hand wrapped around the overhead rail and the other holding her brother's prescription refill inside a paper pharmacy bag. Across the train car, 2 finance interns in expensive wool coats discussed Blackwood Global's merger crisis with animated excitement. I heard some outside consultant fix the entire thing, one said. No, the other replied. Apparently, it was some genius analyst Ethan Blackwood hired secretly. Claire lowered her eyes toward the scratched subway floor. Funny how quickly people rewrote stories once intelligence became valuable. 25 minutes later, she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment building in Queens. Old brick walls, weak hallway lighting, 3rd-floor radiator pipes that clanged every winter like tired machinery refusing to quit. Home. She unlocked apartment 3B quietly and stepped inside. The smell of canned tomato soup filled the tiny kitchen immediately. Claire, a weak voice called from the living room. I am home. Her younger brother Daniel sat wrapped in a gray blanket on the couch beside stacks of medical paperwork and textbooks from the online computer science classes he kept trying to finish between treatments. 20 years old. Too thin lately. But smiling anyway. Always smiling anyway. You are late, he said gently. Claire set the pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter. Big day at work. Daniel studied her face carefully. Something happened. Claire hesitated while removing her damp coat. Daniel knew her too well. I embarrassed a room full of billionaires, she admitted quietly. Daniel blinked once, then laughed unexpectedly. That sounds healthy for them. Claire smiled despite herself while heating soup on the stove. Small apartment, small stove, small life, but peaceful in its own fragile way. Did they finally realize you were smarter than everyone else? Daniel asked. Claire rolled her eyes lightly. Please stop saying that. It is true. It complicates things. Daniel leaned back against the couch cushions, watching her move around the tiny kitchen. You always do that. Claire glanced over. Do what? Act like intelligence is something embarrassing. The soup simmered softly between them. Outside the apartment window, rain tapped against old fire escapes while ambulance sirens echoed faintly somewhere deeper in Queens. Claire stirred the soup quietly. Being smart does not matter much when medical insurance sends $12,000 invoices. Daniel looked down immediately. Claire, do not. Her voice stayed gentle but firm. Do not apologize for surviving. Silence settled briefly across the apartment. Familiar silence. Heavy sometimes. Loving too. Daniel changed the subject carefully. So what happened exactly? Claire handed him a bowl of soup before answering. The company nearly lost a merger. And you fixed it. She shrugged lightly. I corrected a mistake. Daniel smiled faintly. That sounds like your version of saving the world. Claire sat across from him at the tiny folding table near the window. The CEO offered me a position upstairs. Daniel nearly dropped his spoon. Wait. Seriously? Claire nodded once. I said no. This time Daniel actually stared at her in disbelief. Claire. What? You turned down Ethan Blackwood? I turned down Hope, she corrected quietly. Daniel frowned. That is not the same thing. Claire looked toward the rain-covered window beside the table. People like him get inspired by stories for one afternoon. Then reality returns. You do not know that. I do. Her voice softened further. I have spent 3 years watching people look past me while asking if they wanted oat milk in their coffee. Daniel sat silently for a moment. Then he spoke carefully. Maybe the problem is not that they looked past you. Claire raised her eyes slowly. Daniel smiled sadly. Maybe the problem is that you started believing you belonged there. The words landed harder than she expected. Claire looked away immediately. At the same moment, her phone buzzed quietly against the table. Unknown number. Manhattan. Area code. Claire already knew who it was before answering. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Finally, she picked up. Hello. Ethan Blackwood's calm voice filled the silence between raindrops. I know it is late. Claire closed her eyes briefly. How did you get this number? Your emergency contact filed downstairs. That is slightly terrifying. A pause. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan laughed softly. Real laugh this time. Warm enough to surprise both of them. Probably, he admitted. Claire stared quietly at the rain beyond the apartment window, while Daniel watched her with growing curiosity from across the table. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. I am calling because I think you made the wrong decision today. Claire leaned back slowly in her chair. Tired apartment. Cheap soup. Medical bills stacked beside the sink. And I think you are not used to hearing no. Silence. Then Ethan answered quietly. You are probably right about that too. Claire held the phone silently against her ear while rain continued tracing soft lines down the apartment window beside her. Across the tiny kitchen table, Daniel watched her carefully over the rim of his soup bowl, already smiling because he knew that expression on her face. The guarded one. The dangerous one. Ethan Blackwood's voice remained calm on the other end of the call. Tomorrow morning, he said quietly. Come upstairs before your shift. Claire leaned back in her chair. You really do not like losing arguments. I do not like wasting talent. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Manhattan billionaires always spoke about talent like it was an asset class. Something measurable. Something profitable. I already told you no. And I already told you that you made the wrong decision. Daniel tried unsuccessfully to hide his grin across the table. Claire ignored him. You do realize this is extremely inappropriate, right? Probably. Another pause. Then Ethan added softly. But I think pretending you belong in that kitchen is worse. Claire looked down at the faded wood grain of the table beneath her fingertips. Cheap apartment. Flickering overhead light. Prescription bottles beside unpaid bills. Survival. Had a way of shrinking people slowly until they stopped imagining larger rooms for themselves. You barely know me, she whispered. Ethan answered immediately. I know enough. Silence stretched gently between them. Not uncomfortable this time. Just honest. Finally, Claire sighed quietly. One conversation. Daniel nearly choked on his soup. Ethan's voice carried the faintest trace of victory. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. I start downstairs at 7:30. Not anymore. Before Claire could answer, the line disconnected. She stared at the phone for several seconds. Daniel set his spoon down slowly. Please tell me that was Ethan Blackwood personally recruiting you from our extremely depressing kitchen. Claire placed the phone face down on the table. It was not recruiting. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Then what was it? Claire looked toward the rain again. Persistence. The next morning, Manhattan smelled like wet pavement and roasted coffee beans after the storm. Claire arrived at Blackwood Global wearing the same black hospitality uniform as always, though she noticed people looking at her differently the moment she entered the lobby. Security guards nodded nervously. Analysts whispered near the elevators. 2 assistants stopped talking entirely when she walked past them. News traveled fast inside powerful buildings, especially stories that embarrassed executives. Claire kept her eyes forward while stepping into the mirrored elevator toward executive hospitality. Same silver buttons. Same quiet music. Same woman reflected back at herself in the elevator glass. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Martha immediately crossed her arms. You are in trouble. Claire blinked once. That was fast. Martha handed her a sealed envelope with the Blackwood Global crest embossed across the front. Heavy paper. Expensive paper. That arrived 20 minutes ago from the CEO's office. Several staff members pretended not to watch while Claire opened it carefully. Inside sat a single white card. Conference room, 8 o'clock. No signature needed. Martha leaned closer. Claire Monroe, if you become a billionaire before me, I will be deeply offended. Claire laughed softly despite herself. Small laugh. Rare laugh. The kind Daniel always said sounded like someone remembering sunlight after a long winter. At exactly 8 o'clock, Claire stood outside conference room, holding her notepad tightly against her chest. Unlike yesterday's towering glass boardroom, this room felt quieter, smaller, more personal. She pushed the door open carefully. Ethan Blackwood stood alone near the windows overlooking Manhattan. No executives, no analysts. Just him in a charcoal suit with rolled-up sleeves and a tablet resting beside a half-finished cup of black coffee. He looked up immediately when she entered. You came. Claire remained near the doorway. Temporary lapse in judgment. Ethan smiled faintly. Actual smile this time. Subtle, but real enough to soften the sharpness in his face. Sit down, Claire. She hesitated before taking the chair across from him at the long conference table. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through rain clouds outside, casting silver reflections across the polished wood between them. Ethan slid a folder toward her slowly. Open it. Claire frowned slightly before lifting the cover. Her breath caught almost immediately. Director of Strategic Risk Analysis. Full salary. Full benefits. Medical coverage. Tuition reimbursement. Signing bonus large enough to erase nearly every medical debt sitting inside her apartment kitchen drawer. Claire looked up sharply. This is insane. Ethan remained calm. No. Underpaying you downstairs was insane. Claire stared back down at the contract while her pulse quietly accelerated. Numbers like these belong to other people. People with confidence. People with polished resumes and corner offices, and fathers who taught them how to belong in rooms like this. Ethan studied her expression carefully. You are already doing the work, Claire. That is not the same thing. No, he agreed quietly. It is harder. Claire lowered the folder slowly onto the table. Why are you doing this? Ethan looked toward the city beyond the glass windows before answering. Because yesterday I realized something uncomfortable. Claire waited silently. Ethan's voice softened slightly. I built an entire company around recognizing value. He looked back at her then, directly, honestly. And I almost failed to recognize yours because you were carrying a coffee pot. Claire Monroe did not touch the contract for a long time after Ethan Blackwood finished speaking. Morning light stretched softly across the conference table while Manhattan slowly brightened beyond the glass walls around them. Somewhere below, the city moved with its usual urgency. Car horns, steam rising from street vents, thousands of people rushing toward jobs they hated or dreams they were still trying to reach. Inside conference room A, everything felt strangely still. Claire looked again at the salary written across the final page. More money than she had earned in the last 4 years combined. Enough to cover Daniel's treatments. Enough to stop calculating grocery totals in her head before entering stores. Enough to breathe again. And that terrified her more than struggle ever had. Ethan watched the conflict move quietly across her face. You are thinking about running. Claire looked up immediately. That obvious? Very. She leaned back slowly in the leather chair. You make this sound simple. Ethan folded his hands together across the table. It is simple. Claire almost laughed at that. Only rich people say things like that. For a second, Ethan looked genuinely caught off guard. Then he nodded once. Fair point. Silence settled again between them. Not tense anymore. Just thoughtful. Claire closed the folder carefully. People upstairs are going to hate this. Some already do. That does not concern you. Ethan looked toward the skyline outside the windows. I did not build Blackwood Global by making comfortable decisions. Claire studied him quietly. Until now, she had only seen the intimidating version of Ethan Blackwood. The billionaire. The ruthless CEO. The man executives feared enough to go silent when he entered rooms. But sitting here alone across from him, she noticed something else beneath the polished control. Exhaustion. Loneliness maybe. The kind powerful people learn to hide beneath expensive suits and impossible schedules. Why? Are you really doing this? She asked softly. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee cup, then stopped after realizing it had gone cold. Again, Claire noticed the habit instantly. He worked until coffee became room temperature without ever drinking it. Yesterday, Ethan said finally, You walked into a room filled with people trained to believe they were exceptional. He looked directly at her now, and you made all of them feel average. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. That was not my intention. I know. His answer came quickly. That is exactly why it mattered. The conference room door suddenly opened before Claire could respond. Ethan's assistant stepped inside, holding a digital tablet against her chest. Tall, impeccably dressed, efficient in the way people became after surviving years beside powerful executives. Sorry to interrupt, she said carefully, though her eyes immediately flicked toward Claire with open curiosity. The board wants confirmation regarding the Zurich revisions. Ethan barely looked away from Claire. Tell them they will have it within the hour. Yes, sir. The assistant hesitated slightly before adding. They are also asking about the new analyst position. Claire noticed the subtle pause before analyst. The uncertainty. Ethan remained perfectly calm. Then tell them the position has been filled. The assistant glanced once more at Claire's black hospitality uniform before nodding carefully and leaving the room. The moment the door closed, Claire exhaled softly. That right there. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What? That look. Claire tapped the contract lightly. People already think I do not belong here. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Do you? The question landed harder than she expected. Claire opened her mouth immediately, then stopped, because she suddenly was not sure anymore. Ethan watched the realization unfold quietly across her face. You know what the difference is between you and most executives in this building? He asked. Claire folded her arms lightly. Several $1,000,000? A faint smile touched Ethan's mouth again. Most executives spend their entire careers trying to sound intelligent. He nodded toward the financial notes still visible inside her folder. You spend yours trying to hide it. Claire looked down at the papers silently. I got tired of disappointing myself, she admitted softly. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? Claire hesitated. Then for the first time since meeting him, she answered honestly without protecting herself first. Every year I told myself things would stabilize enough for me to go back. Her fingers tightened gently against the folder. Finish graduate school. Publish again. Apply to firms. She gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Then another hospital bill arrived. Ethan said nothing. Claire stared out at the city below them. After a while, surviving becomes addictive. Her voice softened further. You stop dreaming because dreaming starts to feel irresponsible. The room fell silent again. Heavy silence this time. The kind that exposed truths nobody usually admitted out loud. Ethan looked at Claire for several long seconds before speaking quietly. Then maybe it is time somebody reminded you that survival was never supposed to be your final destination. Claire blinked slowly. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Not with pity. Not with admiration either. Just belief. Honest belief. Ethan pushed the contract gently toward her one final time. Come upstairs, Claire. His voice remained calm. Certain. Not because I am offering charity. He held her gaze steadily across the conference table. Because I am finally offering the room to the smartest person in it. 3 weeks later, the executive boardroom at Blackwood Global looked exactly the same. Same glass walls. Same polished walnut table. Same skyline stretching across Manhattan beneath pale winter sunlight. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations lowered when certain doors opened now. Analysts checked numbers twice before presenting them. And for the first time in years, executives arrived early to meetings instead of late. Because everyone knew Ethan Blackwood had quietly changed one rule inside the company. Titles no longer guaranteed respect. Results did. Claire Monroe adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal blazer as the elevator climbed toward the 48th floor. No apron anymore. No silver coffee pot in her hands. Yet she still carried herself with the same quiet calm that once made powerful men underestimate her. Some habits survived every promotion. The elevator doors opened softly. Several employees standing near the executive hallway immediately straightened when they saw her. One young analyst nodded nervously. Good morning, Miss Monroe. Claire smiled politely. She still was not used to that part. Respect sounded strange after years of invisibility. As she walked toward the boardroom, Martha suddenly stepped out from executive hospitality carrying a tray of fresh coffee cups. Look at you, the older woman whispered dramatically. All terrifying and important. Claire laughed softly. I still owe you 3 overnight shifts. You owe me a better coffee machine. Martha glanced proudly at the tailored blazer before lowering her voice. Your brother doing okay? Claire nodded immediately. His latest tests came back stable. Martha squeezed her hand once. Good. For a second, emotion flickered quietly across Claire's face. Not dramatic. Just relief, finally learning how to breathe. Thank you, she whispered. Martha smiled knowingly. Honey, sometimes the world catches up to people it should have noticed sooner. Before Claire could answer, the boardroom doors opened across the hall. Ethan Blackwood stepped out mid-conversation with two executives who instantly stopped talking once they noticed Claire approaching. Ethan dismissed them with a small nod before looking toward her. Dark navy suit, silver tie, calm authority filling the hallway without effort. Yet his expression softened slightly the moment he saw her. Subtle enough that most people would miss it. Claire did not. You are early, he observed. You are usually already inside pretending not to intimidate everyone. Ethan almost smiled. I only intimidate people hiding bad numbers. That narrows it down to roughly 80% of corporate America. This time he actually laughed quietly beneath his breath. The nearby executives looked stunned. Ethan Blackwood almost never laughed at work. Ethan opened the boardroom door for her without thinking. Simple gesture. Respectful gesture. But half the hallway noticed immediately. Claire paused briefly before entering. You know people are staring now. Ethan glanced toward the employees, pretending not to watch them. Let them. Inside the boardroom, 12 executives sat waiting around the conference table. Some of the same people who had laughed the first day Claire spoke. Now laptops closed the moment she entered. Chairs straightened. Attention sharpened. Ethan walked toward his seat at the head of the table, while Claire moved toward the chair beside him. Her chair. Small silver nameplate resting neatly against the polished wood surface. Claire Monroe, Director of Strategic Risk Analysis. She looked at it for a moment longer than usual. Not because she needed reminding. Because part of her still remembered the woman carrying coffee through this same room only weeks earlier, while people looked through her instead of at her. Ethan noticed the hesitation immediately. Something wrong. Claire lowered herself slowly into the chair. Just remembering. Ethan sat beside her quietly. Regretting it. Claire looked around the room. Executives waiting respectfully. Analysts prepared. Sunlight reflecting softly against the skyline beyond the windows. Then she thought about Daniel laughing over takeout containers last night because they finally paid every medical bill sitting unopened on their kitchen counter. She thought about sleeping without panic for the first time in years. She looked back toward Ethan. No, she answered softly. Just adjusting to being seen. The meeting began moments later. Market projections. European expansions. Risk assessments. Normal boardroom language. Yet halfway through the presentation, one senior executive confidently projected an earnings forecast onto the main screen. Claire studied the numbers silently for 3 seconds before speaking. Your third quarter assumptions are inflated by 0.8%. The executive froze immediately. Around the table, several people lowered their eyes toward calculators before Ethan even reacted. 30 seconds later, the executive cleared. His throat awkwardly. She is right. Silence filled the room briefly. Then Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, watching Claire with unmistakable amusement now. You know, he said calmly to the stunned executive team. The interesting thing about Claire is that she warned all of you this would happen. Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. Ethan picked up his coffee cup at last while sunlight reflected softly across the boardroom windows behind him. You just were not listening when she wore an apron. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody looked away either. Because every person in that room finally understood the same truth Ethan Blackwood learned the hard way. Some people do not become extraordinary when the world notices them. Some people were extraordinary long before anyone learned how to look.